The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 1. He watched from the quarterdeck as the chain fed through the whitecaps of the bay, its staccato clatter muffled, hollow in the midday heat. Then he sensed the anchor grab and felt an uneasy tremor pass along the hull as the links snapped taut against the tide. The cannon were already run in and cooling, but vagrant threads of smoke still traced skyward through the scuttles and open hatch, curling ringlets over two draped bodies by the mainmast. Along the main deck, scurvy-blotched seamen, haggard and shirtless to the sun, eased the wounded toward the shade of the forecastle. He drew the last swallow of brandy from his hooped wooden tankard and instinctively shifted his gaze aloft, squinting against the midday sun to watch as two boatswain's mates edged along the yards to furl the mainsail. Then he turned to inspect the triangular lateen sail behind him, parted into shreds by the first Portuguese cannon salvo, its canvas now strewn among the mizzenmast shrouds. A round of cheers told him the last 2 casks of salt pork had finally emerged from the smoky hold, and he moved to the railing to watch as they were rolled toward the cauldron boiling on deck. As he surveyed the faces of the gathering men, he asked himself how many could still chew the briny meat he had hoarded so carefully for this final morning of the voyage. The crowd parted as he moved down the companionway steps and onto the deck. He was tall, with lines of fatigue etched down his angular face and smoke residue laced through his unkempt hair and short beard. His doublet was plain canvas, and his breeches and boots scarcely differed from those of a common seaman. His only adornment was a small gold ring in his left ear. Today, he also wore a blood-stained binding around his thigh, where a musket shot from a Portuguese maintop had furrowed the skin. He was Brian Hawksworth, captain of the 500-ton English frigate Discovery, and captain general of the 3rd voyage of England's new East India Company. His commission, assigned in London over 7 months past, was to take 2 armed trading frigates around the Cape of Good Hope, up the eastern coast of Africa, and then through the Arabian Sea to the northwest coast of India. The company had twice before sailed eastward from the Cape, to the equatorial islands of the Indies. No English vessel in history had ever sailed north for India. The destination of this, the first English voyage to challenge Lisbon's control of the India trade, was the port of Surat, 12 leagues inland up the Tapti River, largest of the only 2 harbors on the Indian subcontinent not controlled by Portugal. He reached for the second tankard of brandy that had been brought and squinted again toward the mouth of the Tapti, where 4 armed Portuguese galleons had been anchored earlier that morning. Damn the company. No one planned on galleons at the river mouth. Not now, not this early in the season. Did the Portugals somehow learn our destination? And if they knew that, do they know the rest of the company's plan? Since the Tapti had been badly silted for decades, navigable only by cargo barge or small craft, he and the merchants must travel upriver to Surat by pinnace, the 20-foot sailboat lashed amidships on the Discovery's main deck. There the merchants would try to negotiate England's first direct trade with India, and Brian Hawksworth would undertake a separate mission, one the East India Company hoped might someday change the course of trade throughout the Indies. He remounted the steps to the quarterdeck and paused to study the green shorelines circling their inlet. The low-lying hills undulated in the sun's heat, washing the Discovery in the dense perfume of land. Already India beckoned, the lure even stronger than all the legends told. He smiled to himself and drank again, this time a toast to the first English captain ever to hoist colors off the coast of India. Then with a weary hand he reached for the telescope, an expensive new Dutch invention, and trained it on his second frigate, the Resolve, anchored a musket shot away. Like the Discovery, she rode easily at anchor, bearing to lee. He noted with relief that her ship's carpenter had finally sealed a patch of oakum and sail in the gash along her portside bow. For a few hours now, the men on the pumps could retire from the sweltering hold. Finally, he directed the glass toward the remains of 2 Portuguese galleons aground in the sandy shallows. Off his starboard quarter, black smoke, still streaming from gaps in their planking, where explosions had ripped through the hull. And for an instant, his stomach tightened, just as it had earlier that morning, when one of those same galleons had laid deep shadows across the Discovery's decks. So close he could almost read the eyes of the infantry, poised with grapples to swing down and board. The Portugals will be back, he told himself, and soon, with fireships. He scanned the river mouth once more. It was deserted now. Even the fishing craft had fled, but upriver would be another matter. Portuguese longboats, launched with boarding parties of infantry, had been stranded when the 2 galleons were lost. Together, they had carried easily 100, perhaps 200 musketmen. They made for the Tapti, he thought grimly, and they'll be upriver waiting. We have to launch before they can set a blockade. Tonight, on the tide. He revolved to find Giles Mackintosh, quartermaster of the Discovery, waiting mutely by his side. Mackintosh, start outfitting the pinnace. We launch at sunset before the last dog watch. The quartermaster pulled at his matted red curls in silence as he studied the tree-lined river mouth. Then he turned abruptly to Hawksworth. Tacking the pinnace upriver'll be a death sentence, Cap'n, I warrant you. Portugals'll be layin' for us, thicker'n whores at a Tyburn hangin'. He paused deliberately and knotted the string holding back hair from his smoke-darkened cheeks. I say we weigh at the tide and ease the frigates straight up their hell-bound river. She's wide as the Thames at Woolwich. We'll run out the guns and hand the pox-rotted papists another taste, o English courtesy. Can you navigate the sandbars? I've seen ni sign of bars. The Indian pilot we took on yesterday claims there's shallows upriver. All the more reason to sail. By my thinking the pilot's a full-bred Moor, and they're all the same, Indian or Turk. Mackintosh blew his nose over the railing, punctuating his disgust. Show me one that's not a liar, a thief, or a damned sodomite. Ni honest Christian'll credit the word of a Moor. There's risk either way. Hawksworth drew slowly on the brandy, appearing to weigh the Scotsman's views. But there's the cargo to think of. Taken for all, it's got to be the pinnace. And this Moorish pilot's not like the Turks. I should know. Aye, Cap'n, as you will. Mackintosh nodded with seeming reluctance, admiring how Hawksworth had retained mastery of their old game, even after 2 years apart. But I'll be watchin' the bastard, airy move he makes. Hawksworth turned and slowly descended the quarterdeck steps. As he entered the passageway leading aft to the great cabin and the merchants' cabins, he saw the silhouette of George Elkington. The chief merchant of the voyage was standing by the quarter-gallery railing, drawing on a long clay pipe as he urinated into the swells. When he spotted Hawksworth, he whirled and marched heavily down the corridor, perfunctorily securing the single remaining button of his breeches. Elkington's once-pink jowls were slack and pasty, and his grease-stained doublet sagged over what had been, 7 months past, a luxuriant belly. Sweat trickled down from the sides of his large hat, streaming oily rivulets across his cheeks. Hawksworth, did I hear you order the pinnace launched tonight? And before we've made safe anchorage for the cargo. The sooner the better. The Portugals know we'll have to go upriver. By tomorrow, they'll be ready. Your first obligation, Sirrah, is the goods. Every shilling the company subscribed is cargoed in these 2 damned merchantmen. A fine fortune in wool broadcloth, Devonshire kersey, pig iron, tin, quicksilver. I've a good £10,000 of my own accounts invest. and you'd leave it all hove to in this piss-crock of a bay, whilst the Portugals are doubtless crewing up a dozen two-deckers down the coast in Goa. 'Tis sure they'll be laid full about this anchorage inside a fortnight. Hawkesworth inspected Elkington with loathing, musing what he disliked about him most: his grating voice, or his small, lifeless eyes. And what you probably don't realize is they'll be back next time with trained gunners. Not like today, when their gun crews clearly were lisping dockside rabble, private traders who'd earned passage out to the Indies on the easy claim they were gunners, half not knowing a linstock from a lamppost. Elkington, I'll tell you as much of our plans as befits your place. Hawkesworth moved past him toward the door of the great cabin. We're taking the pinnace upriver tonight on the tide, and you'll be in it, along with your coxcomb clerk. Captain Carriage of the Resolve will take command of the ships. I've already prepared orders to move both frigates to a new anchorage. I demand to know what damned fool scheme you've hatched. There's no reason you have to know. Right now, the fewer who know the better, particularly the men going upriver. Well, I know this much, Hawkesworth. This voyage to India may well be the East India Company's last chance to trade in the Indies. If we fail 3 voyages in a row, we'd as well close down the company and just buy pepper and spice outright from the damned Hollanders. England's got no goods that'll trade in the Spice Islands south o' here. Remember Lancaster cargoed wool down to the islands on the first 2 company voyages, thinking to swap it for pepper, and discovered for himself what I'd guessed all along: a tribe of heathens sweatin' in the sun have no call for woolen breeches. So either we trade up here in the north, where they'll take wool, or we're finished. The anchorage I've found should keep the cargo and the men safe till we make Surat. With luck, you'll have your cargo a-land before the Portugals locate us. Hawkesworth pushed open the heavy oak door of the great cabin and entered, stranding Elkington in the passageway. And now, I wish you good day. The cabin's dark overhead beams were musty from the heat, and its air still dense with smoke from the cannon. The stern windows were partly blocked now by the 2 bronze demi-culverin that had been run out aft. Stern chaser cannon that could spit a 9-pound ball with deadly accuracy, their lighter bronze permitting longer barrels than those of the cast-iron guns below decks. He strode directly to the oil lantern swaying over the great center desk and turned up the wick. The cabin brightened slightly, but the face of the English lute wedged in the corner seemed suddenly to come alive, shining gold over the cramped quarters like a full moon. He stared at it wistfully for a moment, then shook his head and settled himself behind the large oak desk, and asked himself once more why he had ever agreed to the voyage. To prove something, to the company, to himself. He reflected again on how it had come about, and why he had finally accepted the company's offer. It had been a dull morning in late October, the kind of day when all London seems trapped in an icy gloom creeping up from the Thames. His weekly lodgings were frigid as always, and his mind was still numb from the previous night's tavern brandy. Back from Tunis scarcely a month, he already had nothing left to pawn. 2 years before, he had been leading a convoy of merchantmen through the Mediterranean when their ships and cargo were seized by Turkish corsairs, galleys owned by the notorious Dey of Tunis. He had finally managed to get back to London, but now he was a captain without a ship. In years past, this might have been small matter to remedy, but no longer. England, he discovered, had changed. The change was apparent mainly to seamen. The lower house of Parliament was still preoccupied fighting King James's new proposal that Scotland be joined to England, viewed by most Englishmen as a sufferance of proud beggars and ruffians upon a nation of uniformly upright taxpayers. In London, idle crowds still swarmed the bear gardens to wager on the huge mastiffs pitted against the chained bears. Rioting tenant farmers continued to outrage propertied men by tearing down enclosures and grazing their flocks on the gentry's private hunting estates. And the New Puritans increasingly harassed everyone they disapproved of, from clerics who wore vestments to women, who wore cosmetics to children, who would play ball on Sunday. Around London more talk turned on which handsome young courtier was the latest favorite of their effeminate new king, than on His Majesty's enforcement of his new and strict decree, forbidding privateering, the staple occupation of England's seamen for the last 3 decades of Elizabeth's reign. King James had cravenly signed a treaty of peace with Spain, and by that act brought ruin to 100,000 English sea dogs. They awoke to discover their historic livelihood legally plundering the shipping of Spain and Portugal under wartime letters of marque had become a criminal offense. For a captain without a ship, another commission by a trading company seemed out of the question, and especially now, with experienced seamen standing idle the length of London. Worst of all, the woman he had hoped to return to, red-haired Maggie Tyne of Billingsgate, had disappeared from her old lodgings and haunts, leaving no trace. Rumor had her married, some said, to the master of a Newcastle coal barge, others to a gentleman. London seemed empty now, and he passed the vacant days with brandy and his lute, and thoughts of quitting the sea to do he knew not what. Then in that cold, early dawn appeared the letter, requesting his immediate appearance at the director's office of the East India Company, should this coincide with his convenience. He found its tone ominous. Was some merchant planning to have him jailed for his loss of cargo to the Turks? But he'd been sailing for the Levant Company, not the East India Company. He debated with himself all morning and finally decided to go and face the mercantile bastards. The new offices of the company already seemed embalmed in the smell of lamp oil and sweat, their freshly painted wood timbers masked in dull soot. A stale odor of ink, paper, and arid commerce assailed his senses as he was announced and ushered through the heavy oak door of the director's suite. And he was astonished by what awaited. Standing hard by the director's desk was Maggie. He'd searched the length of London in vain for her, and here she was. But he almost didn't recognize her. Their 2 years apart had brought a change beyond anything he could have imagined. No one would have guessed what she once had been, a dockside girl happiest at the Southwark Bear Gardens, or in a goose-down bed. And somehow, she had always managed to turn a shilling at both wagering with a practiced eye on the snarling dogs brought in to bloody the bears, or taking her pleasure only after deftly extracting some loan. To allay an urgent need, she inevitably remembered the moment she entered his lodgings. That morning, however, she reigned like an exotic flower, flourishing amid the mercantile gloom. She was dressed and painted in the very latest upper-class style, her red hair now bleached deep yellow, sprinkled thick with gold dust, and buried under a feathered hat. Her crushed velvet bodice low-necked, cut fashionably just below the nipples, then tied at the neck with a silk lace ruff. Her once ruddy breasts now painted pale, with blue veins penciled in, and her face carefully powdered lead white, save the red dye on her lips and cheeks, and the glued-on beauty, patches of stars and half-moons. His dockside girl had become a completely modern lady of fashion. He watched in disbelief as she curtsied to him, awkwardly. Then he noticed Sir Randolph Spencer, director of the company. "Captain Hawkesworth, so you're the man we've heard so much about. Understand you escaped from Tunis under the very nose of the damned Turks." He extended a manicured hand while he braced himself on the silver knob of his cane. Although Spencer's flowing hair was pure white, his face still clung tenuously to youth. His doublet was expensive, and in the new longer waist-length style Hawkesworth remembered seeing on young men about town. "'Tis indeed a pleasure. Nay, 'tis an honor." The tone was practiced and polite, a transparent attempt at sincerity rendered difficult by Hawksworth's ragged appearance. He had listened to Spencer mutely, suddenly realizing his loss of cargo had been forgotten. He was being congratulated for coming back alive. "'Twas the wife, Margaret here, set me thinkin' about you. Says you two were lightly acquainted in younger years. Pity I never knew her then myself." Spencer motioned him toward a carved wooden chair facing the desk. "She asked to be here today to help me welcome you. Uncommonly winsome lady, what say?" Hawksworth looked at Maggie's gloating eyes and felt his heart turn. It was obvious enough she'd found her price. At last, she had what she'd always really wanted, a rich widower. But why trouble to flaunt it? He suspected he already knew. She simply couldn't resist. "Now I pride myself on being a sound judge of humanity, Hawksworth, and I've made sufficient inquiry to know you can work a ship with the best. So I'll come right to it. I suppose 'tis common talk the company's dispatchin' another voyage down to the Indies this common spring. Soon as our new frigate, the Discovery, is out of the yard. And this time, our first port of call's to be India." Spencer caught Hawksworth's look, without realizing it was directed past him at Maggie. I know, we all know. The damned Portugals have been there 100 year, thick as flies on pudding. But by Jesus, we've no choice but to try openin' India to English trade." Spencer had paused and examined Hawksworth skeptically. A process of sizing up seemed underway, of pondering whether this shipless captain with the bloodshot eyes and gold earring was really the man. He looked down and inspected his manicured nails for a long moment, then continued. "Now, what I'm about to tell you mustn't go past this room. But first let me ask you, is everything I've heard about you true? 'Tis said the day of Tunis held you there, after he took your merchantmen, in hopes you'd teach his damned Turks how to use the English cannon you had on board. He started building sailing bottoms now, thinking he'll replace the galleys his Turkish pirates have used for so long. His shipwrights are some English privateers who have relocated in Tunis to escape prison here. And he was planning to outfit his new sailing ships with my cannon. He claims English cast-iron culverin are the best in the world. God damn the Barbary Turks, and the Englishmen who have started helping them." Spencer bristled. "Next thing, and they'll be out past Gibraltar, pillaging our shipping right up the Thames. But I understand you revised his plans. The Turks don't have any more cannon now than they had 2 years ago. When I refused to help them, they put me in prison, under guard. But one night, I managed to knife 2 of the guards and slip down to the yard. I worked till dawn and had the guns spiked before anybody realized I was gone. And I hear you next stole a single-masted shallop and sailed the length of the Barbary coast alone, right up to Gibraltar, where you hailed an English merchantman. Didn't seem much point in staying on after that. You're the man all right. Now, 'tis said you learned the language of the Turks while you were in Tunis. Well, sirrah, answer me now, can you speak it or no? For 2 years I scarcely heard a word of English. But what's that to do with trade in India? From what I know, you'll need a few merchants who speak Portuguese, and plenty of English. Hear me out, sir. If all I wanted was to anchor a cargo of English goods and pull off some trade for a season, I'd not be. Needin' a man like you. But let me tell you a thing or so about India. The rulers there now are named Moghuls. They used to be called Mongols, Turkish Afghans from Turkestan, before they took over India about 100 years back. And their king, the one they call the Great Moghul, still speaks some Turkey, the language of the Central Asian steppes. Now, I'm told this Turkey bears fair resemblance to the language of the damned Turks in the Mediterranean. Spencer assumed a conspiratorial smile. I've a plan in mind, but it needs a man who speaks this great Moghul's language. Hawksworth suddenly realized Maggie must have somehow convinced Spencer he was the only seaman in England who knew Turkish. It could scarcely be true. Now I ask you, Hawksworth, what's the purpose of the East India Company? Well, 'tis to trade wool for pepper and spice, simple as that. To find a market for English commodity, mainly wool, and to ship home with cheap pepper. Now we can buy all the pepper we like down in Java and Sumatra, but they'll not take wool in trade. And if we keep on buying there with gold, there'll never be a farthing's profit in our voyages to the Indies. By the same token, we're sure these Moghuls in North India will take wool. They already buy it from the damned Portugals, but they don't grow pepper. Spencer leaned forward, and his look darkened slightly. The hard fact is the East India Company's not done nearly as well as our subscribers hoped. But now the idea's come along, I hate to admit 'twas George Elkington first thought. Of it that we try swappin' wool for the cotton goods they produce in North India, then ship these south and trade for pepper and spice. Indian traders have sold their cotton calicos in the Spice Islands for years. Do you follow the strategy? Spencer had scrutinized Hawksworth for a moment, puzzling at his flash of anger when Elkington's name was mentioned, then pressed forward. Overall, not a bad idea, considering it came from Elkington. Then Spencer dropped his voice to just above a whisper. But what he doesn't understand is if we're going to start trading in India, we'll need a real treaty, like the Hollanders have down in some of the islands. Because once you've got a treaty, you can settle a permanent trading station, what we call a factory, and bargain year-round. Buy when prices are best. Hawksworth sensed the interview would not be short, and he settled uneasily into the chair. Maggie still stood erect and formal, affecting a dignity more studied than natural. As Spencer warmed to his subject, he seemed to have forgotten her. Now, sir, once we have a factory, we can start sending in a few cannon to protect our merchants, like the Hollanders do in the islands, and soon enough we've got the locals edgy. Handle it right, and pretty soon they'll sign over exclusive trade. No more competition. Spencer smiled again in private satisfaction. Are you starting to follow my thinking? What you've described is the very arrangement the Portugals have in India now. Hawksworth tried to appear attentive, but he couldn't keep his eyes off Maggie, who stood behind Spencer, wearing a triumphant smile. And they've got plenty of cannon and sail to make sure their trade's exclusive. We know all about the Portugals' fleet of warships, and their shipyards in Goa, and all the rest. But these things always take time. Took the Portugals many a year to get their hooks into India's ports, but their days are numbered there, Hawksworth. The whole Eastern Empire of the Portugals is rotten. I can almost smell it, but if we dally about, the damned Hollanders are sure to move in. Spencer had become increasingly excited, and Hawksworth watched as he began pacing about the room. Well, if you're saying you want a treaty, why not just send an ambassador to the great Moghul's court? Damn me, Hawksworth, it's not that easy. We send some dandified gentry who doesn't know the language, and he'll end up having to do all his talking through court interpreters. And who might they be? Well, let me just show you, sirrah. Spencer began to shuffle impatiently through the papers on his desk. They're Jesuits, damned Jesuits, papists straight out o' Lisbon. We know for a fact they do all the translatin for the court in Agra. He paused as he rummaged the stacks in front of him. We've just got hold of some Jesuit letters, sent out from the Moghul capital at Agra through Goa, intended for Listen. They'll tell you plain enough what the company's up against. His search became increasingly frenetic. Damn me, they were here. He rose and shuffled toward the door, waving his cane in nervous agitation. Hold a minute. Hawksworth had watched him disappear through the doorway, then looked back to see Maggie laughing. She retrieved a leather-bound packet from the mantel and tossed it carelessly onto the desk. He found himself watching her in admiration, realizing some things never change. What the hell's this about? She smiled, and her voice was like always. "Methinks 'tis plain enough. You want me gone from London this badly. He takes care o' me. At least he loves me. Something you were ne'er capable of." "And what were you capable of? All you wanted was—" She looked away. "I know he'll give me what you ne'er would. At least he has feelin' for me, more than you e'er did or could." Then she turned back and looked at him for a long moment. "Say you'll go, knowin' you're still." "Damn it all," Spencer burst back through the doorway. Then he spied the leather packet. "That's it." He seized the bundle and thrust it toward Hawkesworth. "Read these through, sirrah, and you'll see clear enough what we're up against. There's absolutely no point whatever in postin' a real ambassador now." He hesitated for a moment, as though unsure how to phrase his next point. "The most amazing thing is what they say about the great Moghul himself, the one they call Arangbar. The Jesuits claim the man's scarcely ever sober. Seems he lives on some kind of poppy sap they call opium and on wine. He's a Moor sure enough, but he drinks like a Christian. Downs a full gallon of wine a day. Anne holds audiences with a flagon in his hand. From the letters, I can sense the Jesuits all marvel how the damned heathen does it, but they swear 'tis true. No, sirrah, we can't send some fancy-titled ambassador now. That's later. We want a man of quality, it goes without saying, but he's got to be able to drink with that damned Moor and parley with him in his cups. No Jesuit interpreters." Hawkesworth steadied his hand on the carved arm of the chair, still amazed by Maggie. "What will your subscribers think about sending the captain of a merchantman to the court of Moghul, India?" "Never you mind the subscribers. Just tell me if you'd consider it. 'T will be a hard voyage, and a perilous trip inland once you make landfall. But you sailed the Mediterranean half a decade, and you know enough about the Turks." Spencer tapped his fingers impatiently on his ink-stained blotter. "And lest you're worried, have no doubt the company knows how to reward success." Hawkesworth looked again at Maggie. Her blue eyes were mute as stone. "To tell the truth, I'm not sure I'm interested in a voyage to India. George Elkington might be able to tell you the reason why. Have you told me all of it?" "Damn Elkington, what's he to do with this?" Spencer stopped in front of the desk and fixed Hawkesworth's gaze. "Aye, there's more, but what I'm about to tell you now absolutely has to remain between us. So have I your word?" Hawkesworth found himself nodding. "Very well, sir. Then I'll give you the rest. His Majesty, King James, is sending a personal letter to be delivered to this great Moghul. And gifts. All the usual diplomatic falderal these potentates expect. You deliver the whole affair. Now, the letter'll offer full and free trade between England and India. Nothing more, won't mention the Portugals. That'll come later. This is just the beginning. For now, all we want is a treaty to trade alongside the damned papists. Break their monopoly. But why all the secrecy? 'Tis plain as a pikestaff, sirrah. The fewer know what we're plannin', the less chance of word gettin' out to the Portugals or the Hollanders. Let the papists and the butterboxes look to their affairs after we have a treaty. Remember, the Portugals are swarmin' about the Moghul's court, audiences every day. Not to mention a fleet of warships holding the entire coast. And if they spy your colors, they're not apt to welcome you a land for roast capon and grog. Who else knows about this? Nobody, least of all that windbag Elkington, who'd have it talked the length of Cheapside in a fortnight. He'll be on the voyage, I regret to say, but just as chief merchant, which is all he's fit for, though I'd warrant he presumes otherwise. I'd like a few days to think about it. Hawkesworth looked again at Maggie, still disbelieving. First, I'd like to see the Discovery, and I'd also like to see your navigation charts for the Indian Ocean. I've seen plenty of logs down to the Cape and east, but nothing north from there. And with good reason. We've got no rudders north of the Cape. No English sea dogs ever sailed it, but I've made some inquiries, and I think I've located a salt here who shipped it once, a long time past. A Dutchman named Huygen. The truth is he was born and raised right here in London. He started out a papist, and when things got a bit hot in England back around time of the Armada, he left for Holland. And took a Dutch name. Next he moved on. Down to Portugal, thinking to be a Jesuit, then shipped out to Goa and round the Indies. But he got a bellyful of popery soon enough and came back to Amsterdam. Some years later, he helped out their merchants by telling them exactly how the Portugals navigate the passage round the Cape and out. The Hollanders say hadn't been for the maps he drew up, they'd never have been able to double the Cape in the first place. But he's back in London now, and we've tracked him down. I understand he may have gone a bit daft, but perhaps 'twould do no harm if you spoke to him. And what about the Discovery? I want to see her too. That you will, sir. She's in our shipyard down at Deptford. Might be well if I just at Huygen see you there. By all means look her over, he beamed. And a lovelier sight you're ne'er like to meet. Then, remembering himself, he quickly turned aside. Unless, of course, 'twould be my Margaret here. As agreed, Hawkesworth was taken to Deptford the next day, the company's carriage inching through London's teeming streets for what seemed a lifetime. His first sight of the shipyard was a confused tangle of planking, ropes, and workmen. But he knew at a glance the Discovery was destined to be handsome. The keel had been laid weeks before, and he could already tell her forecastle would be low and rakish. She was 130 feet from the red line of her beakhead to the taffrail at her stern, where gilding already was being applied to the ornate quarter galleries. She was 500 tons burden, each ton some 600 cubic feet of cargo space, and she would carry 120 men when fully crewed. Over her swarmed an army of carpenters, painters, coopers, riggers, and joiners, while skilled artisans were busy attaching newly gilded sculptures to her bow and stern. That day they were completing the installation of the hull chain plates that would secure deadeyes for the shrouds, and he moved closer to watch. Stories had circulated the docks that less than a month into the company's last voyage, the mainmast yard of a vessel had split, and the shipbuilder, William Benton, and his foreman, Edward Chandler, had narrowly escaped charges of lining their pockets by substituting cheap, uncured wood. He noticed that barrels of beer had been stationed around the yard for the workmen, to blunt the lure of nearby alehouses, and as he stood watching, he saw Chandler seize a grizzled old bystander who had helped himself to a tot of beer and begin forcibly evicting him from the yard. As they passed, he heard the old man clad in a worn leather jerkin, his face ravaged by decades of salt wind and hard drink reviling the company. What does the rotten East India Company know o' the Indies? You'll ne'er double the Cape in that pissin shallop. 'Twould scarce serve to ferry the Thames. The old man struggled weakly to loosen Chandler's grasp on his jerkin. But I can tell you T.H. Portugals have got carracks that'll do it full easy. 1,000-ton bottoms that'd hold this skiff in the orlop deck and leave air for 100-barrel o' biscuit. And I've shipped 'em. By all the saints, where's the man standin' that knows the Indies better? Hawkesworth realized he must be Huygen. He intercepted him at the edge of the yard and invited him to a tavern, but the old Englishman-turned-Dutchman bitterly declined. I'll ha' none o' your fancy taverns, lad, a swarm pox-faced gentry fingerin' their meat pies. They'll ne'er take in the likes o' me. Then he examined Hawkesworth and flashed a toothless grin. But there's an alehouse right down the way where a man salt in his veins can still taste a drop in peace. They went, and Hawkesworth had ordered the first round. When the tankards arrived, Huygen attacked his thirstily, maintaining a cynical silence as Hawkesworth began describing the company's planned voyage, then asked him what he knew of the passage east and north of the Cape. As soon as his first tankard was dry, the old man spoke. I made the passage once, why Portugal's. Back in '83, to Goa. And I've been to the Indies many a time since, why Dutchman, but ne'er again to that pissin' sinkhole. But what about the passage north, through the Indian Ocean? I'll tell you this, lad, 'tis a sight different from shootin' down to Java, like the company's done before. 'Tis the roughest passage your e'er like to ship. Portugal's post bottoms twice the burden o' the company's damned little frigates, and still lose 100 men airy voyage out, when scurvy don't take 'em all, and the Dutchmen are scared o' it. Then Huygen returned to his stories of Goa. Something in the experience seemed to preoccupy his mind. Hawkesworth found the digression irritating, and he impatiently pressed forward. But what about the passage? How do they steer north? From the Cape, the company has no charts, no rudders by pilots who have made the passage. And how could they? Huygen evaluated Hawkesworth's purse lying on the wooden table and discreetly signaled another round. The Portugals know the trick, lad, but you'll ne'er find one o' the whoremasters who'll give it out. But is there a trade wind you can ride, like the westerly to the Americas? Nothing o' the sort, lad, but there's a wind sure enough. Only she shifts about month by month. Give me that chart and I'll show you. Huygen stretched for the parchment Hawkesworth had brought, the new map of the world published by John Davis in 1600. He spread it over the table, oblivious to the grease and encrusted ale, and stared at it for a moment in groggy disbelief. Then he turned on Hawkesworth, who drew up this map. It was assembled by an English navigator, from charts he made on his voyages. He's the lion son of a Spaniard's whore. I made this chart o' the Indies by my own hand, years ago, for the Dutchman. But what's the difference? He copied it right. Huygen spat on the floor, and then stabbed the east coast of Africa with a stubby finger. Now you come out o' the Mozambique Channel and into the Indian Ocean too early in the summer. You'll be the only bottom fool enough to be out o' port. The monsoon'll batter you to planking. Get there too late, say past the middle o' September, and you're fightin' a head wind all the way. She's already turned on you, but come north round by Socotra near the end o' August, and you'll ride a steady gale right into North India. That's the tail o' the monsoon, lad, just before the winds switch about. 2 weeks, 3 at most. That's all you'll get. But steer it true and you'll make landfall just as India's ports reopen for the autumn tradden season. Huygen's voice trailed off as he morosely inspected the bottom of his tankard. Hawkesworth motioned for a third round, and as the old man drew on the ale, his eyes mellowed. Aye, you might make it. There's a look about you tells me you can work a ship. But why would you want to be going? Tea will swallow you up, lad. I've only been to Goa, mind you, down on India's west coastline, but that was near enough. I ne'er saw a man come back once he went in India proper. Something about it keeps him there. Portugal says she always changes a man. He loses touch why what he was. Nothing we know about counts for anything there, lad. What do you mean? How different could it be? I saw plenty of Moors and Tunis. Huygen laughed bitterly. If you're thinkin' 'tis the same as Tunis, then you're a bigger fool than I took you for. Nay, lad, the more part's the very least o' it. He drew on his tankard slowly, deliberately. I've thought on a considerable time, and I think I've deciphered what 'tis, but 'tis not a thing easy to spell out. Huygen was beginning to drift now, his eyes glazed in warm forgetfulness from the ale. But still, he continued. You know, lad, I actually saw some Englishmen go into India once before. Back in '83, year I was in Goa, and they were ne'er heard from since. Hawkesworth stared at the old man a moment, and suddenly the name clicked, and the date 1583. Huygen must have been the Dutch Catholic, the one said to speak fluent English, who'd intervened for the English scouting party imprisoned in Goa that year by the Portuguese. He tried to still his pulse. Do you remember the Englishmen's names? seemed to recall they were led by a man named Sims. But 'twas a long time past, lad. Aye, Goa was quite the place then. Lucky I escaped when I did. And there, you stay a while and something starts to hold you. Too much India about the place. After a while, all this, Huygen gestured fondly about the alehouse, where sweat-soaked laborers and seamen were drinking, quarreling, swearing as they bargained with a scattering of weary prostitutes in dirty, tattered shifts. All this seems. He took a deep draught of ale, attempting vainly to formulate his thoughts. I've ne'er been one why words, but don't do it, lad. You go all the way into India, and I'll wager you'll ne'er be heard from more. I've seen it happen. Hawkesworth listened as Huygen continued, his stories of the Indies, a mixture of ale and dreams. After a time, he signaled another round for them both. It was many empty tankards later when they parted, but Huygen's words stayed. And that night, Brian Hawkesworth walked alone on the quay beside the Thames, bundled against the wet autumn wind, and watched the ferry lanterns ply through the fog, and heard the muffled harangues of streetwalkers and cabmen from the muddy street above. He thought about Huygen, and about the man named Roger Sims, and about the voyage to India. And he thought, too, about Maggie, who wanted him out of London before her rich widower discovered the truth, or before she admitted the truth to herself. But either way, it no longer seemed to matter. That night, he decided to accept the commission. The Discovery rolled heavily, and Hawkesworth glanced instinctively toward the pulley lines that secured the 2 bronze cannon. Then he remembered why he had left the quarterdeck, and he unlocked the top drawer of the desk and removed the ship's log. He leafed one more time through its pages, admiring his own script strong, but with an occasional flourish. Someday this could be the most valuable book in England, he told himself. If we return. This will be the first log in England to describe what the voyage to India is really like. The company will have a full account of the weather and sea, recorded by estimated longitude, the distance traveled east. He congratulated himself again on the care with which he had taken their daily speed, and used it to estimate longitude every morning since the Cape, the last location where it was known exactly. And as he studied the pages of the log, he realized how exact Huygen's prediction had been. The old man had been eerily correct about the winds and the sea. They had caught the tail o' the monsoon precisely. August 27, course NE FTE, the wind at WS, with gusts and rain, made 36 leagues today. Estimated longitude from the Cape 42 degrees 50 E. August 28, course NE, the wind at west, a fresh gale with gusts and rain this 24 hours. Leagues 35, estimated longitude from the Cape 44 degrees 10 E. The late August westerly Huygen had foretold was carrying them a good 100 land miles a day. They rode the monsoon's tail, and it was still angry. But there was no longer a question that English frigates could weather the passage. As August drew to a close, however, scurvy had finally grown epidemic on his sister ship, the Resolve. The men's teeth loosened, their gums bled, and they began to complain of aching and burning in their limbs. It was all the more tragic for the fact that this timeless scourge of ocean travelers might at long last be preventable. Lancaster, on the very first voyage of the East India Company, had stumbled onto an historic discovery. As a test, he'd shipped bottles of the juice of lemons on his flagship and ordered every seaman to take 3 spoonfuls a day. And his had been the only vessel of the 3 to withstand scurvy. Hawkesworth had argued with Captain Carriage of the Resolve, insisting they both stow lemon juice as a preventative. But Carriage had always resented Lancaster, particularly the fact he'd been knighted on return from a voyage that showed almost no profit. He refused to credit Lancaster's findings. No connection. By my thinkin' Lancaster just had a run o' sea dog luck, Then he goes about claimin' salt meat brings on the scurvy. A pack o' damned foolishness. I say salt meat's fine for the lads. Boil it up with a mess o' dried peas, and I'll have it myself. The resolve LL be provisioned like always. See biscuit, salt pork. Hollander cheese. Any fool knows scurvy comes from men sleepin' in the night dews off the sea. Secure your gun ports by night, and you'll ne'er see the damned scurvy. Hawkesworth had suspected Carriage's real reason was the cost. Lemon juice was imported and expensive. When the company rejected his own request for an allowance, he had provisioned the discovery out of his own advance. Carriage had called him a fool, and when they sailed in late February, the Resolve was unprovided. Just as Hawkesworth had feared, the Resolve's crew had been plagued by scurvy throughout the voyage, even though both vessels had put in for fresh provisions at Zanzibar in late June. 6 weeks ago, he had had no choice but to order half his own remaining store of lemon juice transferred to the sister ship, even though this meant reducing the Discovery's ration to a spoon a day. Not enough. By the first week of September, they were so near India they could almost smell land, but he dared not try for landfall. Not yet. Not without an Indian pilot to guide them past the notorious sandbars and shoals that lined the coast like giant submerged claws. The monsoon winds were dying. Indian shipping surely would begin soon, so they hove to, waiting. And as they waited, they watched the last kegs of water choke with green slime, the wax candles melt in the heat, and the remaining biscuit all but disappear to weevils. Hungry seamen set a price on the rats that ran the shrouds. How long could they last? Hawkesworth reached the last entry in the log. Yesterday, the day they had waited for. Sept 12, laid by the lee. Estimated longitude from the Cape, 50 degrees 10 E. Latitude observed 20 degrees 30. At 7 in the morning, we command a large ship from the country to heave to by shooting 4 pieces across her bow. Took from the ship an Indian pilot, paying in Spanish rials of 8. First offered English gold sovereigns, but these refused as unknown coin. Also purchased 6 casks water, some baskets, lemons, melons, plant. Ains. The provisions had scarcely lasted out the day, spread over twice 100 hungry seamen. But with a pilot, they could at last make landfall. And landfall they had made, at a terrible price. Yet even this anchorage could not be kept. It was too exposed and vulnerable. He had expected it to be so, and he had been right. But he also knew where they might find safety. The previous night, he had ordered the Indian pilot to sketch a chart of the coastline on both sides of the Tapti River Delta. He did not tell him why. And on the map, he had spotted a cove 5 leagues to the north, called Swally, that looked to be shallow and was also shielded by hills screening it from the sea. Even if the Portuguese discovered them, the deep draft of Portuguese galleons would hold them at sea. The most they could do would be send boarding parties by pinnace or fire ships. The cove would buy time to replenish stores, perhaps even to set the men ashore and attend the sick. The longer the anchorage could be kept secret, the better their chances. He had already prepared sealed orders for Captain Carriage, directing him to steer both frigates there after dark, when their movement could not be followed by the hidden eyes along the coast. He took a deep breath and flipped forward to a blank page in the log, and realized this was the moment he had been dreading, been postponing, the last entry for the voyage out. Perhaps his last ever if events in India turned against him. He swabbed more sweat from his face and glanced one last time at the glistening face of the lute, wondering what he would be doing now, at this moment, if he still were in London, penniless, but on his own. Then he wiped off the quill lying neatly alongside the leather-bound volume, inked it, and shoved back the sleeve of his doublet to write. The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 2. The events of that morning were almost too improbable to be described. After taking on the Indian pilot, Hawkesworth's plan had been to make landfall immediately, then launch a pinnace for Surat, there to negotiate trade for their goods and safe conduct to the capital at Agra for himself. If things went as planned, the goods would be exchanged, and he would be on his way to the Moghul capital long before word of their arrival could reach Goa and the Portuguese. The pilot's worth was never in question. A practiced seaman, he had steered them easily through the uncharted currents and hidden swallows of the bay. They had plotted a course directly east-northeast, running with topgallants on the night breeze to make dawn anchorage at the mouth of the Tapti River. Through the night, the resolve had stayed with them handily, steering by their stem lantern. When the first light broke in the east, hard and sudden, there it lay, the coast of India, the landfall, the sight they had waited for the long 7 months. Amid the cheers, he had ordered their colors hoisted, the Red Cross, bordered in white, on a field of blue, the first English flag ever to fly off India's coast. But as the flag snapped its way along the poop staff, and the men struck up a hornpipe on deck, their triumph suddenly was severed by a cry from the maintop. Sails off the starboard quarter. In the sudden hush that rolled across the ship like a shroud, freezing the tumult of voice and foot, Hawkesworth had charged up the companionway to the quarterdeck. And there, while the masts tuned a melancholy dirge, he had studied the ships in disbelief with his glass. 4 galleons anchored at the river mouth, Portuguese men-of-war, each easily 1,000-ton, twice the size of the Discovery. He had sorted quickly through his options. Strike sail and heave to on the odds they may leave. It was too late. Run up Portuguese colors, the old privateer's ruse, and possibly catch them by surprise. Unlikely. Come about and run for open sea? Never. That's never an English sea dog's way. No, keep to windward and engage. Here in the bay. Mackintosh. Hawkesworth turned to see the quartermaster, already poised expectantly on the main deck. Order Maloyer to draw up the gun ports. Have the sails wet down and see the cookroom fire is out. Aye, sir, this'll be a bloody one. What counts is who bleeds most. Get every able man. On station. As Hawkesworth turned to check the whipstaff, the long wooden lever that guided the ship's rudder, he passingly noted that curious conflict of body sensation he remembered from 2 encounters in years past. Once, when on the Amsterdam run, he had seen privateers suddenly loom off the coast of Scotland, and then on his last voyage through the Mediterranean, when his convoy first spotted the Turkish pirate galleys, while his mind calculated the elements of a strategy, coolly refining each individual detail. His stomach belied his rational facade and nodded in instinctive, primal fear. And he had asked himself whether this day his mind or his body would prevail. The odds were very bad, even if they could keep the wind, and if the Portuguese had trained gun crews. Then he spotted the Indian pilot, leaning casually against the steering house, his face expressionless. He wore a tiny mustache and long, trimmed sideburns. And unlike the English seamen, all barefoot and naked to the waist, he was still dressed formally, just as when he came aboard. A fresh turban of white cotton, embroidered in a delicate brown, was secured neatly about the crown of his head, exposing his long ears and small. Jeweled earrings. A spotless yellow cloak covered the waist of his tightly tailored blue trousers. Damn him, did he somehow know? Did he steer us into a trap? Seeming to read Hawkesworth's thoughts, the pilot broke the silence between them, his turkey heavily accented with his native Gujarati. This is your first test. Officers of the Moghul's army are doubtless at the shore, observing. What will you do? What do you think we'll do? We'll stand the bastards, and with Maloyer's gunners I think we can. Then permit me an observation, a modest thought, but possibly useful. Do you see there? He pulled erect and pointed toward the shore, hard by the galleons, there where the seabirds swirl in a dark cloud. That is the river mouth, and on either side are many sandbars, born there from the river's delta. Along the coast beyond these, though you cannot see them now, are channels. Too shallow for the draft of a galleon, but perhaps safe for these frigates. Reach them, and you will be beyond range of all Portuguese ordnance, save their stern demi-culverin. Then they will be forced to try boarding you by longboat, something their infantry does poorly, and with great reluctance. Are there channels on both sides of the river mouth, to windward and to leeward? Certainly, my Faringhie captain. He examined Hawkesworth with a puzzled stare. But only a fool would not hold to port, to windward. Hawkesworth studied the shoreline with the glass, and an audacious gamble began to take form in his mind. Why try to keep both frigates to windward? That's what they'll expect, and any moment now they'll weigh and beat to windward also. And from their position, they'll probably gain the weather gauge, forcing us to leeward. Downwind where we can't maneuver. That means an open fight when the Resolve can barely muster a watch. How can she crew the gun deck and man the sheets? But maybe she won't have to. Maybe there's another way. Mackintosh. The quartermaster was mounting the quarterdeck companionway. Order the mainsail and foresail reefed, and the topsails shortened. We'll heave to while we run out the guns, and signal the Resolve while I prepare orders for carriage. The grizzled Scotsman stood listening in dismay, and Hawkesworth read his thoughts precisely in his eyes. There's nee time to heave to, and for wha? We strike an inch o' canvas, and the fornicatin' Portugals'll take the weather gauge sure. How you nee stomach for a fight? Why not just haul down colors and ha done with it? But he said nothing. He turned automatically and bellowed orders aloft. Hawkesworth felt out the morning breeze, tasting its cut, while he watched the seamen begin swinging themselves up the shrouds, warming the morning air with oaths as the Discovery pitched and heeled in the chop. And then he turned and strode down the quarterdeck companionway toward the great cabin to prepare orders for the Resolve. As he passed along the main deck, half a dozen crewmen were already unlashing the longboat from its berth amidships. And when he emerged again on deck with the oilskin-wrapped dispatch, after what seemed only moments, the longboat was already launched, oarsmen at station. He passed the packet to Mackintosh without a word, then mounted the companionway ladder back to the quarterdeck. The Indian pilot stood against the banister, shaded by the lateen sail, calmly studying the galleons. 3 of these I know very well. His accented Turkey was almost lost in a roll of spray off the stern. They are the Saint Sebastian, the Bon Jesus, and the Bon Ventura. They arrived new from Lisbon last year, after the monsoon, to patrol our shipping lanes, to enforce the regulation that all Indian vessels purchase a trading license from authorities in Goa. And what of the 4th? It is said she birthed in Goa only this spring. I do not know her name. There were rumors she brought the new viceroy, but early, before his 4-year term began. I have never before seen her north in these waters. My God, Hawkesworth looked at the warships in dismay. Is this the course of the company's fortune? A voyage depending on secrecy blunders across a fleet bearing the incoming viceroy of Goa, the most powerful Portuguese in the Indies. They are invincible, the pilot continued, his voice still matter of fact. The galleons own our waters. They have 2 decks of guns. No Indian vessel, even the reckless corsairs along our southern coast of Malabar, dare meet them in the open sea. Owners who refuse to submit and buy a Portuguese trading license must sail hundreds of leagues off course to avoid their patrol. And what do you propose? That we heave to and strike our colors, without even a fight? Hawkesworth was astonished by the pilot's casual unconcern, Is he owned by the Portugals too? You may act as you choose. I have witnessed many boasts of English bravery during my brief service aboard your ship. But an Indian captain would choose prudence at such a time. Strike colors and offer to pay for a license. Otherwise, you will be handled as a pirate. No Englishman will ever pay a Portugal or a Spaniard for a license to trade or a permit to piss. Hawksworth turned away, trying to ignore the cold sweat beating on his chest. We never have, we never will. The pilot watched him for a moment and then smiled. You are in the seas off India now, Captain. Here the Portuguese have been masters for 100 years. His voice betrayed a trace of annoyance at Hawksworth's seeming preoccupation, and he moved closer. You would do well to hear me out. We know the Portuguese very well, better perhaps than you. Their cruelties here began a full century ago, when the barbarous Captain Vasco da Gama first discovered our Malabar coast, near the southern tip of India. He had the Portuguese nose for others' wealth, and when he returned again with 20 ships, our merchants rose against him. But he butchered their fleet and took prisoners by the thousand. He did not, however, simply execute them. First, he cut away their ears, noses, and hands and sent these to the local Raja, recommending he make a curry. Next, a Portuguese captain named Albuquerque came with more warships to ravage our trade in the north, that on the Red Sea. And when servants of Islam again rose up to defend what is ours, Allah the Merciful once more chose to turn his face from them, leaving all to defeat. Soon, the infidel Portuguese came with many fleets, and in a span no more than a male child reaching manhood, had seized our ocean and stolen our trade. The pilot's face remained blandly expressionless as he continued, but he reached out and caught Hawksworth's sleeve. Next, they needed a Portuguese trading station, so they bribed pirates to help storm our coastal fortress at Goa, an island citadel with a deep port. And this place they made the collection point for all the pepper, spices, jewels, dyes, silver, and gold they have plundered from us. They lacked the courage to invade India herself, as the Moghuls did soon after, so they made our sea their infidel empire. It is theirs from the coast of Africa to the Gulf of Persia to the Malacca Islands. And they seek not merely conquest or enforced commerce, but also our conversion to their religion of cruelty. They have flooded our ports with ignorant priests. To them, this is a crusade against Islam, against the one true faith. A crusade that has triumphed for a time, where barbarous Christian land assaults on our holy Mecca have always failed. Then the pilot turned directly to Hawksworth, and a smile flickered momentarily across his lips. And now you English have come to challenge them by sea. You must pardon me if I smile. Even if you prevail today, which I must tell you I doubt, and even if one day more of your warships follow and drive them from our seas entirely, even if all this should take place, you will find your victory hollow, as theirs has been, for we have already destroyed them. The way India consumes all who come with arms, the ancient way. They have robbed our wealth, but in return we have consumed their spirit. Until at last they are left with nothing but empty commodity. It will be no different for you, English captain. You will never have India. It is India who will have you. He paused and looked again toward the galleons, their sails swelling on the horizon. But today, I think the Portuguese will spare us the trouble. Hawksworth examined the pilot, struggling to decipher his words. Let me tell you something about England. All we ask is trade, for you and for us, and we don't have any priests to send. Only Catholic traders do that, and if you think we'll not stand well today, you know even less about the English. The thing we do best is fight at sea. Our sea dogs destroyed the entire navy of Spain 20 years ago, when they sent their armada to invade England. And even to this day, the Spaniards and Portugals have never understood our simple strategy. They still think a warship's merely a land fortress afloat. All they know to do is throw infantry against a ship and try to board her. The English know sea battles are won with cannon and maneuverability, not soldiers. Hawksworth directed the pilot's gaze down the Discovery. The ship was of the new English race-built class, low in the water and swift. Absent were the bulky superstructures on bow and stern that weighed down a galleon, the castles that Spanish and Portuguese commanders used to stage infantry for boarding an enemy vessel. A full 30 years before, the English seaman and explorer John Hawkins had scoffed at these, as had Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. They saw clearly that the galleon's towering bow and stem, their forecastle and poop, slow them, since the bluff beamy hull needed to support their weight wouldn't bite the water. A superstructure above decks serves only to spoil a warship's handling in a breeze, they declared, and to lend a better target to an English gunner. Your ships assuredly are smaller than Portuguese galleons. I agree, the pilot volunteered after a pause. But I see no advantage in this. You'll see soon enough. The Discovery may be low, but she'll sail within 6 points of the wind, and she's quicker on the helm than anything afloat. Hawksworth raised the glass and studied the galleons again. As he expected, they were beating to windward, laboring under a full head of canvas. Good, now the Resolve can make her move. The longboat was returning, its prow biting the trough of each swell, while on the Resolve seamen swarmed the shrouds and rigging. Hawksworth watched with satisfaction as his sister ship's main course swiveled precisely into the breeze, and her spritsail bellied for a run down the wind. Her orders were to steer to leeward, skirting the edge of the galleon's cannon range. And if I know the Portugals, he told himself, they'll be impatient enough to start loosing round after round of shot at her, even from a quarter mile off. It takes courage to hold fire till you're under an enemy's guns, but only then do you have accuracy. Noise and smoke are battle enough for most Portugals, but the main result is to overheat and immobilize their cannon. As the Discovery lay hove to, biding time, the Resolve cut directly down the leeward side of the galleons, laboring. Under full press of sail, masts straining against the load. The Indian pilot watched the frigate in growing astonishment, then turned to Hawksworth. Your English frigates may be swift, but your English strategy is unworthy of a common mahout who commands an old she-elephant with greater cunning. Your sister frigate has now forfeited the windward position. Why give over your only advantage? Even as he spoke, the 4 Portuguese warships, caught beating to windward, began to shorten sail and pay off to leeward to intercept the Resolve, their bows slowly crossing the wind as they turned. I've made a gamble, something a Portugal would never do, Hawksworth replied. And now I have to do something no Englishman would ever do, unless outgunned and forced to. Before the pilot could respond, Hawksworth was gone, heading for the gun deck. The ring of his boots on the oak ladder leading to the lower deck was lost in the grind of wooden trucks. As seamen threw their weight against the heavy ropes and tackles, slowly hauling out the guns. The Discovery was armed with 2 rows of truck-mounted cast-iron culverin, and she had sailed with 22 barrels of powder and almost 400 round shot. Hawksworth had also stowed a supply of crossbar shot and deadly langrel-thin casings filled with iron fragments for use against enemy rigging, and sail at close quarters. Shafts of dusty light from the gun ports and overhead scuttles relieved the lantern-lit gloom, illuminating the massive beams supporting the decks above. Sleeping hammocks were lashed away, but the space was airless, already sultry from the morning sun, and the rancid tang of sweat mixed with fresh saltpeter from the gunpowder caught in Hawksworth's mouth, bittersweet. He walked down the deck, alert to the details that could spell victory or loss. First, he checked the wooden tubs of vinegared urine and the long swabs stationed between the cannon. used for cleaning burning fragments of metal from the smoking barrels after each round. Fail to swab a barrel, and there could be an unplanned detonation when the next powder charge was tamped into place. Then he counted the budge barrels of powder, now swathed in water-soaked blankets to fend off sparks, and watched as Edward Malloyer, the man some called the best master gunner in England, inspected each cannon's touch hole as its lead plate was removed, assuring himself it had not corroded from the gases expelled during their last gunnery practice in the Mozambique Channel. Master Malloyer, "Aye, sir, all's in order. We'll hand the Spanish bastards a taste, O English iron." Malloyer, who had never troubled to differentiate Portugal from Spain, was built like a bear, with short bowed legs and a tree stump frame. He drew himself erect, his balding pate easily clearing the rugged overhead beams, and searched the gloom. The worshipful company may ha' signed on a sorry lot o' pimpin' apple squires, but by Jesus, I've made Englishmen owe them. My sovereign to your shilling, we hold the pox-rotted papists why the first round. I'll stand the wager, Malloyer, and add the last keg of brandy. But you'll earn it. I want the portside battery loaded with crossbar forward and langrel aft, and set the langrel for the decks, not the sail. Malloyer stared at him incredulously. The command told him immediately that this would be a battle with no quarter. The use of langrel against personnel left no room for truce. Then, suddenly, the true implications of Hawkesworth's command hit him like a blow in the chest. That's shots for close quarters. We lay alongside, and the bastards'll grapple and board us sure. Swarm us like curs on a bitch. That's the order, Malloyer. Be quick on it. Set the starboard round first, and light the linstocks. Hawkesworth turned to count the shot, and absently picked up one of the linstocks lying on deck, an iron-plated staff, used to set off a cannon, fingering the oil-soaked match rope at its tip, and inhaling its dank musk. And the smell awoke again the memory of that last day 2 years before in the Mediterranean, with Turkish pirate galleys fore and aft, when there had been no quarter and no hope. "Beggin' your pardon, sir." Malloyer's voice was urgent, bringing him back. "What's the fear in orders?" "Just fire the starboard round as a broadside, and set for the lower gun deck." "Aye, aye, sir." He paused. "And Lord Jesus pray we'll live to swab out." Malloyer's parting words would have followed him up the ladder to the main deck, but they were swallowed in the muffled roll of cannon fire sounding over the bay. The galleons were spreading, circling the Resolve as they bore down upon her, and they had begun to vomit round after round, jets of water randomly around the frigate as she plunged toward the shallows and safety. Any minute now, Hawkesworth told himself, and she'll be in the shallows if she doesn't run aground on a bar. Then he saw the Resolve begin to come about, reefing and furling her sails. She's made the shallows, and the Portugal's guns have quieted. "Permission to set sail, sir. The bleedin' Portugals'll be on her in a trice." Mackintosh stood on the quarterdeck by the steering house, and he made no attempt to disguise the anxiety in his eyes. Give the Portugals time, Mackintosh, and you'll see their second fatal mistake. The first was overheating the cannon on their upper decks. The second will be to shorthand their crews. They are out of cannon range now, so they'll launch longboats and assign half the watch as oarsmen. Here, take the glass. Tell me what you see. Mackintosh studied the shallows with the telescope, while a smile slowly grew on his hard face. "I'm a motherless Dutchman, and there's a King's Guard o' Portugal musketmen loadin' in, wearin' their damned silver helmets. They haven't changed in 30 years, Hawkesworth smiled to himself. The Portugals still think their infantry is too dignified to row, so they assign their crews to the oars and leave their warships shorthanded. But they won't find it easy to board the Resolve from longboats, not with English musketmen in her maintop, and that should give us just enough time. Are all the longboats out yet, Mackintosh?" "Aye, sir." The quartermaster steadied the glass against the roll of the ship, and making for the Resolve like they was runnin' from hell itself. Then bear full sail, 2 points to windward of the Bastard on the left, full press and hoist the spritsail. Keep the wind and pay her room till we're in range. With an exultant whoop, Mackintosh jabbed the sweat-soaked telescope toward Hawksworth and began bellowing orders to the mates. Within moments, sails unfurled and snapped in the wind, sending the Discovery's bow biting into the chop and hurtling spray over the bulwarks. Hawksworth kept to the quarterdeck, studying the nearest warship with the glass. The galleon's forecastle towered above the horizon, now like some Gothic fortress. And with the glass, he could make out pennants blazoned from all her yardarms. Then he turned toward the Indian pilot, whose gaze was riveted on the Portuguese warships. "What's the name of the galleon on the left, the large one?" Hawksworth pointed toward the vessel he had been observing with the glass. "I can't read it from this distance." "That one is the Bonventura. We know her to be heavily armed. I'd say she's over 1,000 tons burden. I wonder how handy she'll be with her best men out in the longboats. She'll meet you soon enough with her full bounty. It is said that last year she caught and sank a 20-gun Dutch frigate trading in the Moluccas. She'll still have to come about into the wind." Hawksworth seemed not to hear the pilot now, so absorbed was he in the looming battle. As though in answer to his thoughts, the Bonventura started to heel slowly about, like an angered bull. But the Discovery now had the windward position secure, and the Portuguese ship would have to tack laboriously into the wind. Her canvas was close-hauled, and she would be slow. "We've got the weather gauge now," Hawksworth told himself, "and we'll hold it." Then he noticed that the second galleon in the row, the St. Sebastian, had also begun wearing around, bringing her stern across the wind as she too turned to meet the Discovery. "They've deciphered our plan," Hawksworth said quietly to himself, "and now it's 2 of the bastards we'll face. But with luck, we'll engage the Bonventura before the St. Sebastian can beat to range. And the Bonventura is drawing away from the fleet. That bit of bravado will cost her." The Discovery was closing rapidly on the Bonventura. In minutes, they would be within range. Mackintosh was at the whipstaff now, holding their course, his senses alert to every twist in the wind. He involuntarily clenched and unclenched his teeth, while his knuckles were bloodless white from his grip on the hardwood steering lever. Hawksworth raised the glass again, knowing what he hoped to see. "The Portugals have just made their 3rd mistake, Mackintosh." He tried to mask his excitement. "They've sealed the lower gun ports to shut out water while they're tacking, so after they get position, they'll still have to run out the lower guns. Aye, that's why 2-deckers won't buy a whore's chastity on a day like this. But they'll have the upper guns on us soon enough. Wait and see, Mackintosh. I'll warrant their upper guns are overheated by now. They'll think twice about trying to prime them just yet. They'll have to wait a bit, perhaps just long enough for us to get alongside. Then the upper guns'll touch nothing but our rigging." The breeze freshened even more, driving the Discovery rapidly toward her target. Mackintosh eyed the galleon nervously, knowing the frigate was heavily outgunned. Finally, he could bear the tension no longer. "We've got range now, permission to bring her about. Steady as she goes, they're slow on the helm." Hawksworth glanced at the line of seamen along the port side, untying bundles of musket arrows and lighting the linstock. "Bosun, are the men at stations?" "Aye, sir," a gravel voice sounded through the din. "Stocks were a bit damp, but I warrant the hellish sun's drying 'em out. We'll give the fornicators a fine English salute." Hawksworth gauged the galleon's course, estimating her speed and her ability to maneuver. Then he saw her start coming about in the water, turning to position the starboard battery for a broadside. Gun ports on the lower deck flipped up, and cannon began slowly to emerge, like hard black fangs. Nervous sweat began to bead on Macintosh's brow as the Discovery held her course directly down the galleon's windward side. The Bonaventura's broadside battery was not yet set, but a sudden burst of black smoke from her starboard boat chaser sent a ball smashing through the Discovery's quarter gallery, removing much of its ornate embellishment. Then came another flare of smoke and flame, hurtling a second ball through the lateen sail above Macintosh's head. The quartermaster went pale and looked imploringly at Hawksworth. "Steady as she goes, Macintosh. They still haven't fully set their guns." The knot in Hawksworth's stomach was like a searing ball of fire. "God, for a brandy. But we've got to hold till we've got sure range. To come about now would keep our distance and mean a classic battle. One we're sure to lose." He pushed away the realization of the immense chance they were taking. But now there was no turning back, even if he wanted. Finally, he could bear it no longer. God make it right. "Now, Macintosh, bring her hard about." The quartermaster threw his weight against the whipstaff, shouting orders to the two seamen on the deck below to haul the tackles on the tiller, helping him flip the rudder. Then he turned and bellowed commands to the mates. "Hands to the braces, bring her hard about." The seamen poised incredulously in the maintop and foretop cheered as they began to haul in the ropes securing the yards, and in moments the sails swiveled off the wind. The Discovery careened in the chopping seas, responding readily to the shift in rudder and canvas. By this time, Hawksworth was standing over the scuttle above the gun deck, shouting to Maloyer. "Coming about. Prepare to fire the starboard battery when your guns bear." The Discovery had wheeled a sharp arc in the water, laying herself broadside to the galleon, hardly 50 yards away. The English seamen aloft stared mutely at the towering forecastle of the Portuguese warship, most never before having seen a galleon at close range. Although the guns on her upper deck were still silent, had they spoken now, they would have touched nothing but the frigate's topsails. But as the galleon turned, the cannon on her lower deck were coming into final position. In moments, she would lay the Discovery with a broadside. Hawksworth watched her carefully, calculating, and then the knot in his stomach dissolved like ice in the sun. The Discovery would be in position seconds ahead. Maloyer's command to fire cut the awe-stricken silence. The next instant, a low roar seemed to emanate from all the timbers of the English frigate, while red-tipped flame tongued from her starboard side. The ship heeled dangerously sideways, while black smoke, acrid and searing, boiled up through the scuttles and hatch, as though propelled on its way by the round of cheers from below decks. The traditional salute of ship's gunners. Hawksworth later remembered noting that the battery had fired in perfect unison, not losing the set of a single gun by the ship's recoil. A medley of screams came first, piercing the blackened air. Then the smoke drifted downwind, over the side of the Bonaventura, revealing a savage incision where her lower gun deck had once been. Cannon were thrown askew, and the mangled forms of Portuguese gunners, many with limbs shattered or missing, could be seen through the splintered hull. But Hawksworth did not pause to inspect the damage. He was already yelling the next orders to Macintosh, hoping to be heard above the din. The advantage of surprise would be short-lived. "Pay off the helm, bring her hard about." Again the rudder swiveled in its locks, while seamen aloft hauled the sheets and braces, but this time the Discovery came about easily, using the wind to advantage. As he turned to check the whipstaff, Hawksworth heard a high-pitched ricochet off the steering house and sensed a sudden dry numbness in his thigh. Only then did he look up to see the line of Portuguese musketmen on the decks of the Bonaventura, firing sporadically at the English seamen on decks and aloft. Damn, a lucky shot by some Lisbon recruit. He seized a handful of coarse salt from a bucket by the binnacle and pressed it against the blood. A flash of pain passed briefly through his consciousness and then was forgotten. The Discovery's stern had crossed the wind. There was no time to lose. He moved down the companionway to again shout orders to Maloyer on the gun deck. "Set for the forecastle and rigging. Fire as your guns bear." The Bonventura still lay immobile, so unexpected had been the broadside. But a boarding party of Portuguese infantry was poised on the galleon's forecastle superstructure, armed with swords and pikes, ready to fling grapples and swing aboard the frigate. The Portuguese had watched in helpless amazement as the Discovery completely came about and again was broadside. Suddenly, the captain of the infantry realized what was in store and yelled frantically at his men to take cover. But his last command was lost in the roar of the Discovery's guns. This time flames and smoke erupted from the Discovery's portside battery, but now it spewed knife-edged chunks of metal and twisting crossbars. Again, the screams came first, as the musketmen and infantry on the forecastle were swept across the decks in the deadly rain. Crossbars chewed through the galleon's mainsail, parting it into two flapping remnants, while the rigging on the foremast was blown by the boards, tangling and taking with it a party of musketmen stationed in the foretop. Now the galleon bobbed helpless in the water, as the last seamen remaining on the shrouds plunged for the decks and safety. "When you're ready, Mackintosh." The quartermaster signaled the boatswain, and a line of seamen along the port gunwales touched musket arrows to the lighted linstock and took aim. Streaks of flame forked into the tattered rigging of the Bonventura, and in moments her canvas billowed red. Again, the Portuguese were caught unaware, and only a few manned water buckets to extinguish the burning shreds of canvas drifting to the deck. They were almost alongside now, but no Portuguese infantry would pour down the side of the forecastle onto their decks. The galleon's decks were a hemorrhage of the wounded and dying. By Jesus, 'tis a sight for English eyes. Edward Maloyer's blackened face, streaked with sweat, bobbed up through the hatch over the gun deck, and he surveyed the wreckage of the Bonventura. "Had to give a look, Cap. See if my lads earn their biscuit." He beamed with open pride. "Maloyer, how does it stand below decks?" Hawksworth yelled from the quarterdeck. Starboard side swabbed out. "How shall we load him, sir?" Maloyer leaned backward to gain a better look at the galleon, which now towered above them. "Round shot, and run them out fast as you can." "Aye, sir, and no more close quarters, if you please. Ne'er want to be this close to one o' the bastards again." Maloyer started to retreat through the hatch, but then he turned, paused for a second, and yelled at Hawksworth. "Beggin' your pardon, Cap. I knew all along 'twas best to pull alongside and lay MY crossbar. Just wanted to give the lads a bit o' a scare. Keep 'em jumpin'." Hawksworth waved his hand and watched as Maloyer's pudgy frame dropped through the gun deck hatch like a rabbit, diving for its warren. Mackintosh was standing on the main deck, his tangled red mane blackened with smoke, watching as the Discovery drifted slowly toward the side of the bobbing galleon. Then, when they were only feet away, he signaled the boatswain, and a line of English seamen lit the waiting fuses and began to loft clay powder pots across the waist of the Bonventura, now almost above their heads. When they had finished, he passed orders, and the Discovery began to pull away before her sails could ignite. Then one by one, the powder pots started to explode, spewing burning sulfur over the Portuguese vessel's decks. Hawksworth watched the carnage and asked himself if he had been right to do what he'd done. They'd have sunk us, cut down the men and taken the officers and merchants to a Goa prison. And then what? We couldn't have sunk them with cannon in a week. The only choice was fire. Then he turned to see the St. Sebastian making toward them. Her cannon were already run out, and at any moment she would start coming about for a broadside. Again, he felt the throb in his thigh, and it triggered a wave of fear that swept upward from his stomach. The Indian pilot stood next to him, also watching the approaching galleon. "I have seen a miracle, Captain. Allah the Compassionate has watched over you today." The pilot's face showed none of the strain of battle, and his clothes were still spotless, oddly immune from the oily smoke that blackened all the English seamen. "But I fear there cannot be two miracles on the same morning. You are about to pay for your fortune. Perhaps there is still time to strike your colors and save the lives of your men. We surrender now and will rot in a Goa prison forever, or be pulled apart on the strappado." Hawksworth glared back. "And I seem to recall the Quran says do not falter when you've gained the upper hand." "You do not have the upper hand, my captain, and the Holy Quran speaks only of those who trust in Allah, the Merciful." His voice trailed off as he turned to stare at Hawksworth. "It is not common for a Feringhi to know the Holy Quran. How is it you? I just spent 2 years in a Turkish prison, and I heard little else." Hawksworth turned and was testing the wind, weighing his options. The Saint Sebastian was almost on them. Her cannon were already run out, and at any moment she would start coming about for a broadside. He could still hear the trucks of the cannon below decks as the starboard battery was being run out. And he knew the portside crews were only now beginning to swab the last glowing shreds of metal from the cannon barrels. Good God, there's no time to set the ordnance. They'll blow us to hell. He deliberated for a long moment, weighing his options. As he watched, the Saint Sebastian began to shorten sail, preparing to come about and fire. Only minutes remained. Then he noticed that the wind on the burning Bonaventura's superstructure was drifting her in the direction of the approaching Saint Sebastian. And he hit on another gamble. They've shortened sail in order to come about, which means they are vulnerable. Now if I can make them try to take their bow across the wind with their sails shortened. Mackintosh, take her hard about. Set the courses for a port tack. Once again the Discovery heeled in the water, her stern deftly crossing the wind, and then she was back under full sail, still to windward of the burning galleon. The sudden tack had left the burning Bonventura directly between the English frigate and the approaching galleon. The Discovery pulled away, keeping the wind, forcing the galleon to tack also if she would engage them. Hawksworth watched, holding his breath as Portuguese seamen began to man the sheets, bringing the Saint Sebastian's bow into the wind. It was fatal. The approaching galleon had shortened too much sail in preparation to come about for the broadside, and now she lacked the momentum to cross the wind. Instead, the sluggish, top-heavy warship hung in stays, her sails slack, her bulky bow fighting the wind, refusing to pay off onto the opposite tack. All the while the Bonventura was drifting inexorably toward her, flaming. I was right. Hawksworth thought. She didn't have the speed to bring her bow around. With his glass, he watched the galleon's captain order her back to the original tack. But time had run out. Blinding explosions suddenly illuminated the gun ports of the burning Bonventura, as powder barrels on the gun decks ignited, first the upper and then the lower. In only moments, the fire found the powder room aft of the orlop deck, and as the English seamen looked on spellbound, the galleon seemed to erupt in a single cloud of fire, rocketing burning timbers and spars across the sea's surface. The mainmast, flaming like a giant taper, snapped and heaved slowly into the forecastle. Then the superstructure on the stern folded and dropped through the main deck, throwing a plume of sparks high into the morning air. Although the Saint Sebastian had righted herself, she still had not regained speed, for now the sails had lost their luff and sagged to leeward. Why isn't she underway? Hawksworth asked himself. Surely she'll circle and engage us. He looked again with the glass, and the reason became clear. The Portuguese crewmen on the Saint Sebastian had begun throwing themselves into the sea. terrified at the sight of the Bonventura's blazing hull drifting slowly across their bow. The wind had freshened again and was pushing the burning galleon rapidly now. The blaze had become an inferno, fueled by casks of coconut oil stored below decks on the galleon, and Hawksworth involuntarily shielded his eyes and face from the heat that, even at their distance, seared the Discovery. As he watched, the drifting Bonventura suddenly lurched crazily sideways, and then came the sound of a coarse, grinding impact as her burning timbers sprayed across the decks of the St. Sebastian. In moments, the second galleon was also an abandoned inferno, her crew long since afloat in the safety of the sea, clinging to debris and making for shore. Allah has been merciful twice to you in one morning, Captain. I had never before known the extent of his bounty. You are a man most fortunate. The pilot's words, spoken softly and with pronounced gravity, were almost drowned in the cheers that engulfed the decks and rigging of the Discovery. The battle's just begun. Boarding parties are at the Resolve, and there are 2 more galleons. Hawksworth reached for the glass by the binnacle. No, Captain, I doubt very much the Portuguese will trouble you further. Your luck has been too exceptional, but they will return another day. The pilot squinted toward the shore, as though confirming something he knew should be there. Hawksworth trained his glass on the 2 galleons that still held the Resolve pinned in the shallows. They were heeling about, preparing to run southward on the wind under full press of sail. He also realized their longboats had been abandoned. Some were following futilely after the retreating galleons, while others were already rowing toward the river mouth. The English frigate had been forgotten. Then he noted that although pennants no longer flew from the yardarms of the galleons, the large, unnamed vessel had run out a brilliant red ensign on her poop staff. He studied it carefully, then turned to the pilot, extending the glass. Take a look and tell me what the colors are on the large man-of-war. I've never seen them before. The pilot waved away the telescope with a smile. I need no Christian device to tell you that. We all know it. With all your fortune, you have failed to understand the most important thing that happened today. And what is that? Those are the colors of the Viceroy of Goa, flown only when he is aboard his flagship. You have humiliated him today. The colors speak his defiance, his promise to you. As the pilot spoke, Mackintosh came bounding up the companionway to the quarterdeck, his soot-covered face beaming. What a bleedin' day! What a bleedin' day! Then his eyes dimmed for an instant. But a man to be called a liar who told the story. How many dead and wounded, Mackintosh? 2 maintenance killed by musket fire. And a boatswain's mate took a splinter in the side, very bad, when the bastards laid us why the first boat chasers. A few other lads took musket fire, but the surgeon'll sew 'em up fine. Then break out the last keg of brandy, and see that Maloyer's men get the first tot. But don't forget to send a tankard to the quarterdeck. Mackintosh broke an appreciative grin and headed down the companionway ladder. The sun was baking the decks now, and a swarm of locusts had appeared from nowhere to buzz about the maintop. The wind was beginning to slacken in the heat, and silence slowly settled over the Discovery. Hawksworth turned his glass one last time to the large galleon. He could still make out the ensign over the crests of surf, blood red in the sun. The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 3. The bells sounded ending the afternoon watch and calling the first dog watch. Only 4 hours since noon, but already the morning's carnage seemed a memory from a distant lifetime. Sultry tropic air, motionless and stifling, immersed the Discovery as the gaunt-faced seamen labored to finish securing the mast of the pinnace. Mackintosh had ordered the pinnace's sail unrolled on deck, and as he inspected the stitches for rot, he alternately reviled the men, the heat, the company. Hawksworth had completed the log and stood in the companionway outside the great cabin to watch the preparations, take the air, and exercise his leg. All the previous night he had stood on the quarterdeck, keeping the helm and translating for the pilot. And tonight again there would be no sleep. There's time for a rest now, his weary mind urged. Till the first bell of this watch, half an hour. Then he cursed himself for his weakness, his readiness to yield, and shoved open the door of the great cabin. The oil lamp swayed with each roll of the ship, punctuating the rhythmic creak of the wood paneling and adding to the sweltering heat. He locked the door, then strode aft to push ajar the two stern windows. But the stolid air lay inert, refusing to lift. He would have to prepare the chest in suffocating misery. So be it. Brushing the hair back from his eyes, he unlocked a bronzed sea chest and began to extract one by one the articles entrusted to the company by King James. First was the letter, in English with a formal copy in diplomatic Spanish, both scribed on parchment and sealed in a leather case secured with His Majesty's impression in red wax. The seal, set in London over 7 months before, was soft in the heat now. Pliant to his touch, he surveyed the room for a moment, and then his eye hit on the pair of formal thigh-length stockings the company had insisted he pack. Perfect. He bound his hose around the king's letter, knotted it protectively over the seal, and tossed the bundle into the smaller wooden chest he would take ashore. Then he began to transfer the royal presents: a brace of gold-plated pistols, a half-dozen silver-handled swords, a small silver-trimmed saddle, a set of delicate Norwich crystal, jeweled rings, a leather-bound mirror, a silver whistle studded with emeralds, a large cocked hat trimmed in silk, a miniature portrait of King James, and finally, a dozen bottles of fine English sack. He checked each item for damage, and then packed them tightly into the small chest. Finally, he inserted a tightly fitting false bottom and covered it with a coarse woolen rug. Then the second packing began. He started with more gifts, these for port officials, mainly silver-trimmed knives and rings set with small, inexpensive pearls. He also enclosed several boxed sets of English gold sovereigns, which the company had requested be distributed as widely as possible, in hopes they would begin to be accepted. Finally, he looked about the room for personal goods. First, he folded in a new leather jerkin, then next to it packed a new pair of leather boots. He stared at the boots for a moment, and then removed them while he carefully wrapped 2 primed pistols and slid one deep into each hollow toe. Next to the boots, he packed a case of Spanish brandy he had been saving, for personal use aland. Lastly, he took his glistening English lute from its corner berth, held it for a moment, and tested the strings. He adjusted the tuning on one string, then wrapped the lute's melon-shaped body in a silk cloth and nestled it next to the brandy. As he secured the lock on the chest and pocketed the large brass key, he suddenly asked himself how he would get the chest into India without its being searched. I'm not a genuine ambassador. I'm the captain of a merchantman with no diplomatic standing. The company, for all its mercantile wisdom, neglected to consider that small difficulty. So I'll just have to sound like an ambassador. That shouldn't be so hard. Just be impressed with your own importance, and find nothing, food or lodgings, sufficiently extravagant. Then he drew himself erect and unlocked the door of the great cabin. Only one thing remained. Mackintosh, the quartermaster, was in the pinnace now, fitting the tiller, and he glanced up in irritation. Send the pilot to my cabin. Hawksworth had scarcely seated himself behind the great oak table before the tall chestnut-skinned man appeared in the doorway. Hawksworth examined the face again, expressionless and secure, asking himself its years. Is he 30? Is he 50? The features seemed cast from an ageless mold, hard and seamless, immune to time. May I be of service? Repeat your name for me. Hawksworth spoke in Turkish. And tell me again the business of your vessel. My name is Karim Hassan Ali. The reply came smoothly, but almost too rapidly for Hawksworth to follow. My ship was the Rahimi, a pilgrim vessel on her return voyage from Mecca, by way of Aden, to our northern port of Diu. We carry Muslim pilgrims outbound from India in the spring and return after the monsoon. As you assuredly must know, for 1,000 years, Mecca has been the shrine all followers of Islam must visit once in their life. Our cabins are always full. Hawksworth recalled the vessel and his astonishment at her size. She had 5 masts and was easily 1,200 tons, over twice the burden of the Discovery, and greater than anything he had ever seen before, even the most ambitious Spanish carrack. But when they spotted her, tacking eastward across the Bay of Cambay, she was unarmed and hove to almost before they had fired across her bow. Why unarmed, he had asked himself then. And why strike so readily? Now he understood. And you were the pilot for the Rahimi. I am called the Muzalan. A note of formality entered the Indian's voice, and he instinctively drew himself more erect. Is that the pilot? Yes, but more. Perhaps it is like your first mate. But I am in full charge of navigation for the Nakuda, the owner. To you, he would be captain. And what was your salary for the voyage? I received 200 rupees for the trip to Aden, and am allowed 2 extra cabins of goods for personal trade. Hawksworth smiled resignedly to himself, remembering he had unquestioningly delivered to the Nakuda a bag of Spanish rials, of 8, equivalent to 500 Indian rupees, to buy out the pilot's contract. Then he spoke. Tonight we go upriver to Surat. You're still in my service, and you'll be pilot. I had expected it. I know the river well. Will there be any Portugal traders on the river? Hawksworth searched his eyes, hoping to monitor their truthfulness. I would not expect it. Although this year's monsoons are past, and the river has returned to normal, there are new sandbanks. Every season they shift, becoming more treacherous. Only those of us who know the river well understand the moods of her sands. I have never seen Tapiwala traders in Surat this early in the season. Karim paused, following Hawksworth's puzzled expression, then continued with an air of condescension. Tapiwala is our word meaning men who wear hats. We call Christian traders Tapiwalas. He fixed Hawksworth squarely. And we have other names for their priests. Call Christians what you will, but just remember England is not Portugal. Hawksworth's tone stiffened. England has rid herself of the popery that still rules the Spaniards and Portugals, along with their fear-mongering Jesuits and their damned Inquisition. It's now treason to practice Catholic rites in England. I have heard something of your petty European squabbles, your Christian rivalries. Is it your intention now to spread them to India as well? All England wants is trade, nothing else. Hawksworth shifted his leg, leaning forward to tighten the bandage. I'm here as an ambassador, to convey the friendship of my king and his offer of free and open trade. And after you begin this trade, what then? Will you next try to drive the Portuguese from our ports, so that you can steal away shipping from our own merchantmen, as they have done, and demand we pay you for a license to ply our own seas? I told you we only want trade. England has no use for sailing licenses or priests. Our only enemies here are the Portugals, and the damned Hollanders if they start trying to interfere. Karim studied Hawksworth in silence, fingering his jeweled earring in thought, as he recalled the morning's battle. 2 small English merchant frigates had prevailed over 4 Portuguese warships, galleons. Never before, he told himself, have the Portuguese been humiliated before our eyes. Pigeons must already be winging word of this incredible encounter to Agra. Separately, no doubt. To the Moghul and to the Queen. But Queen Janahara will know first, as always, and she will know her Portuguese profits are no longer secure. And what about Prince Jadar? Yes, the prince will already have heard, hours ago. What will Prince Jadar decide to do? That's the most important question now. Just tell me about the navigation of the river. Hawksworth continued, unable to decipher Karim's distant expression. How long will it take for our pinnace to reach Surat? We cast off at sunset. The tide will be running in tonight, and that will aid your oarsmen. Karim instantly became businesslike. There will also be a night breeze off the sea, but the Portuguese have no authority on our river. Once you are inland, you are under the rule of the governor of Surat. And, of course, Prince Jadar, whom the Moghul has appointed to administrate this province. Hawksworth heard the first bell and walked to the stern. Windows to monitor the slant of the dying sun and to inhale the fresh evening air. Then he wheeled and examined Karim, the pilot's face shadowed in the half-light. And who are these officials, this governor and prince? Karim smiled and carefully secured the fold of his turban. The governor administers the port of Surat. He collects trading duties of the Moghul's court in Agra. Prince Jadar is the son of the Moghul and the military ruler of Gujarat, this province. Then who will I meet in Surat? Hawksworth groped for a pattern. The governor or the prince? Again Karim paused, wondering how much to tell before continuing evenly. Neither of these need concern you now. The first official you must satisfy will be the Shabandar, what the Moghuls call the Mutasadi. The Shabandar controls the customs house, the portal for all who would enter the Moghuls' domain. His power over the port is absolute. Hawksworth slapped one of the bronze cannon to punctuate his dismay. In India also. Good Jesus, every Muslim port in the world must have this same petty official. I've heard that Shabandar is Persian for Lord of the Haven. And if that's true, the office is named perfectly. Everyone I've known has had the right to refuse entry to anyone, at his whim, if bribes are insufficient and no more powerful official intervenes. Who does the Shabandar here answer to? The governor, the prince, the Moghul himself, or somebody else you haven't told me about yet? Hawksworth tried to push back his rising anxiety. Captain, you have, in your guileless Feringhi way, raised a question it is wiser not to pursue. I can only assure you the Shabandar is a man of importance in Surat and in India. But who should I seek out when we reach Surat? At that moment, 2 bells sounded on the quarterdeck, and with them, a ray from the fading sun pierced the stern window, glancing off the oak boards of the table. A twilight silence seemed to settle uneasily over the Discovery, amplifying the creaking of her boards. Captain, I have already told you more than most foreigners know. You would be wise to prepare now to meet the Shabandar. Karim rose abruptly and bowed, palms together, hands at his brow. You must forgive me. In Islam, we pray at sunset. Hawksworth stared after him in perplexity, as Karim turned and vanished into the darkened companionway. Not yet even a land, and already I sense trouble. He fears the Shabandar, that's clear enough, but I'm not sure it's for the usual reasons. Is there some intrigue underway that we're about to be drawn into? God help us. He took a deep breath, and fighting the ache in his leg, made his way out to the quarter gallery on the stern. A lone flying fish, marooned in the bay from its home in the open sea, burst from the almost placid waters, glinting the orange sun off its body, and settling with a splash. annoying the seabirds that squabbled over gallery scraps along the port side. Seamen carrying rations of salt pork and biscuit were clambering down the companionway and through the hatch leading to the lower deck and their hammocks. Hawkesworth listened to them curse the close, humid air below, and then he turned to inhale again the land breeze, permeated with a green perfume of almost palpable intensity. Following the direction of the sweetened air, he turned and examined the darkening shore one last time. India now seemed vaguely obscured, as through a light mist. Or was it merely encroaching darkness? And through this veil, the land seemed somehow to brood. Or did it beckon? It's my imagination, he told himself. India is their all right, solid ground, and scarcely a cannon shot away. India, the place of fable and mystery to Englishmen for centuries, and also the place where a certain party of English travelers disappeared so many years ago. That should have been a warning, he told himself. It's almost too ironic that you're the next man to try to go in. You, of all the men in England, are you destined to repeat their tragedy? He recalled again the story he knew all too well. The man financing those English travelers almost 3 decades past had been none other than Peter Elkington, father of George Elkington, chief merchant on this voyage. Like his son, Peter Elkington was a swearing, drinking, whoring merchant, a big-bellied giant of a man who many people claimed looked more and more like King Harry the older and fatter he got. It was Peter Elkington's original idea, those many years back, to send Englishmen to India. The time was before England met and obliterated the Armada of Spain, and long before she could hope to challenge the oceanic trade networks of the Catholic country Spain to the New World, Portugal to the east. In those days, the only possible road to India for England and the rest of Europe still was overland. The centuries-old caravan trail that long preceded Portugal's secret new sea route around the Cape. The idea of an English mission overland to India had grown out of Peter Elkington's Levant Company, franchised by Queen Elizabeth to exploit her new treaty with the Ottoman Turks, controllers of the caravan trade between India and the Mediterranean. Through the Levant Company, English traders could at last buy spices directly at Tripoli from overland caravans traveling the Persian Gulf and across Arabia, thereby circumventing the greedy Venetian brokers, who for centuries had served as middlemen for Europe's pepper and spices. But Peter Elkington wanted more. Why buy expensive spices at the shores of the Mediterranean? Why not extend England's own trade lines all the way to India and buy directly? To gain intelligence for this daring trade expansion, he decided to finance a secret expedition to scout the road to India, to send a party of English traders through the Mediterranean to Tripoli, and on from there in disguise across Arabia to the Persian Gulf, where they would hire passage on a native trader all the way to the western shore of India. Their ultimate destination was the great Moghul Efquotes court, deep in India. And hidden in their bags would be a letter from Queen Elizabeth, proposing direct trade. Eventually, 3 adventurous traders were recruited to go, led by Roger Sims of the Levant Company. But Peter Elkington wanted a 4th for protection, and he eventually persuaded a young army captain of some reputation to join the party. The captain, originally a painter, who had later turned soldier after the death of his wife, was vigorous, spirited, and a deadly marksman. Peter Elkington promised him a nobleman's fortune if they succeeded, and he promised to take responsibility for Captain Hawkesworth's 8-year-old son, Brian, if they failed. Peter Elkington himself came down to the Thames that cold, gray February dawn they set sail, bringing along his own son, George a Pudgy, pampered adolescent in a silk doublet. Young George Elkington regally ignored Brian Hawkesworth, a snub only one of the two still remembered. As the sails slowly dissolved into the icy mist, Brian climbed atop his uncle's shoulders to catch a long-last glimpse. No one dreamed that only one of the four would ever see London again. Letters smuggled back in cipher kept the Levant Company informed of progress. The party reached Tripoli without incident, made their way successfully overland through Arabia, and then hired passage on an Arab trader for her trip down the Persian Gulf. The plan seemed to be working perfectly. Then came a final letter from the Portuguese fortress of Hormuz, a salt-covered island peopled by traders, overlooking the straits between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, gateway to the Arabian Sea and India's ports. While waiting at Hormuz for passage on to India, the English party had been betrayed by a suspicious Venetian and accused of being spies. The Portuguese governor of Hormuz had nervously imprisoned them and decreed they be shipped to Goa for trial. After waiting a few more months for further word, Peter Elkington finally summoned Brian Hawksworth to the offices of the Levant Company and read him this last letter. He then proceeded to curse the contract with Captain Hawksworth that rendered the Levant Company responsible for Brian's education should the expedition meet disaster. Peter Elkington admitted his plan had failed, and with that admission, the Levant Company quietly abandoned its vision of direct trade with India. But Brian Hawksworth now had a private tutor, engaged by the Levant Company, a tousle-haired young apostate recently dismissed from his post at Eton for his anti-religious views. This new tutor scorned as dogmatic the accepted subjects of Latin, rhetoric, and Hebrew, all intended to help Elizabethan scholars fathom abstruse theological disputations, and insisted instead on mathematics and the new subject of science. His anti-clerical outlook also meant he would teach none of the German in fashion with the Puritans, or the French and Spanish favored by Catholics. For him, all that mattered was classical Greek, the language of logic, pure philosophy, mathematics, and science. The end result was that the commoner Brian Hawksworth received an education far different from, if not better than, that of most gentlemen, and one that greatly surpassed the Hornbook alphabet, and numbers that passed for learning among others of his own class. To no one's surprise, Brian Hawksworth was his father's son, and he took naturally to marksmanship and fencing. But his first love came to be the English lute, his escape from the world of his tutors, hard numbers and theorems. It lasted until the day he was 14, the day the Levant Company's responsibility expired. The next morning, Brian Hawksworth found himself apprenticed to a Thames waterman and placed in service on one of the mud-encrusted ferryboats that plied London's main artery. After 3 months of misery and ill pay, he slipped away to take a berth on a North Sea merchantman. There he sensed at once his calling was the sea, and he also discovered his knowledge of mathematics gave him an understanding of navigation few other seamen enjoyed. By then, he scarcely remembered his father or the luckless expedition to India, until the day Roger Sims appeared alone back in London. Almost 10 years after that icy morning, the Levant Company's expedition had sailed. The Discovery groaned, and Hawksworth sensed the wind freshen as it whipped through the stern quarter gallery and noticed the increasingly brisk swirl of the tide. Almost time to cast off. As he made his way back to the great cabin for a last check, his thoughts returned again to London, those many years ago. He had found Sims at the offices of the Levant Company, nursing a tankard of ale as he sat very close to their large, roaring fireplace. He bore little resemblance to the jaunty adventurer Hawksworth, remembered from that long-ago morning on the Thames. Now he was an incongruous figure, costumed in a tight-fitting new silk doublet and wearing several large gold rings. yet with a face that was haggard beyond anything Hawksworth had ever seen. His vacant eyes seemed unable to focus as he glanced up briefly, and then returned his stare to the crackling logs in the hearth. But he needed no prompting to begin his story. "Aye, 'tis a tale to make the blood run ice." Sims eased open a button of his ornate doublet and shakily loosened his new rough collar. After the Venetian rogue gets us a rest with his damnable lie, the bastard Portugals clap us in the hold of a coast-in barge mackin for Goa, in company with near 100 Arab horses. When we finally make port, they haul us out of that stink hole and slam us in another. This time the Viceroy's dungeons. We took ourselves for dead men. But what happened to my father? Hawksworth blinked the sweat from his eyes, wanting the story, but wanting almost more to escape the overheated, timbered offices that loomed so alien. That's the horrible part o' the story. It happened the next morning, poor luckless bastard. We're all marched into this big stone-floored room where they keep the strappado. What's that? 'Tis a kindly little invention o' the Portugals, lad. First, they bind your hands behind your back and run the rope up over a hangin' pulley block. Then they hoist you up in the air and set to jivin' at little tugs, mackin' you hop like you're dancin' the French La Volta. When they tire o' the sport, or they're due to go say their rosary beads, they just give it a good strong heave and pop your arms out o' your shoulders. Jesuits claim 'twould make a more prey to the Pope. Hawksworth found himself watching Sims's wild eyes as he recounted the story, and wondering how he could remember every detail of events a decade past. Then this young captain comes in, struttin' bastard, hardly a good 20 year on him. Later I made a point to learn his name, Vajantes, Miguel Vajantes. What did he do? Had to see him, lad, eyes black and hard as onyx, and he sports this sword he's had made up with rubies in the handle. Ne'er saw the likes o' it before or since, and in India. But he's a Portugal, though, through and through. No doubt on that one. But what did he do? Why, he has the guards sling Hawksworth up in the strappado, lad, seein' he's the strongest one o' us. Figured he'd last longer, I suppose, make more sport. Vajantes had them torture my father. I thinks he'll squeeze a confession and be a hero. But all Hawksworth ne'er said a word. All day. By nightfall, Vajantes has pulled his arms right out. They carried him out of the room a dead man. Hawksworth still remembered how his stomach turned at that moment, with the final knowledge that his father was not merely missing, or away as he had told himself, and others, but had been coldly murdered. He had checked his tears, lest Sims see, and pressed on. What happened to you and to the others? Did he torture you next? Would have, not a doubt on't. We all wondered who'd be the next one. Then that night they post a Jesuit down to our cell, a turncoat Dutchman by the name of Huygen, who spoke perfect English, thinkin' he'd cozen us into confessin'. But he hates the Portugals, and more'n we do. And he tells us we'd most likely go free if we pretend to turn papist. So the next day we blurt out we're actually a band o' wealthy adventurers in disguise. Rich lads out to taste the world, but we've seen the error o' our ways, and we've decided to forswear the flesh and turn Jesuits ourselves. Thinkin' of donatin' everything we own to their holy order. Sims paused and nervously drew a small sip from his tankard of spiced ale. Vicious papist bastards. Did they really believe you? Guess the Dutchman must have convinced him somehow. Anyway, our story looked square enough to get us out on bail, there being no evidence for the charge o' spying in any case. But we'd hardly took a breath of air before our old friend the Hollander comes running with news the Viceroy's council just voted to ship us back to Lisbon for trial. That happens, and we're dead men. No question. We had to look to it. Sims seemed to find concentration increasingly difficult, but he extracted a long-stemmed pipe, and began stuffing black strands into it with a trembling hand while he composed himself. Finally, he continued. Had to leave Goa that very night. What else could we do? So we traded what little we had for diamonds, sewed them up in our clothes, and waded the river into India. By dawn, we're beyond reach the Portugals. In India. And then, lad, is when it began. What happened? T would take a year to tell it all. Somehow, we eventually got to the great Moghul's court. I think he was named Ackman. And we start living like I never thought I'd see. Should have seen his city, lad, made London look like a Shropshire village. He had a big red marble palace called Fedepur Sekri, with jewels common as rocks, and gold everywhere, and gardens filled with fountains, and mystical music like I'd ne'er heard. And dancing women that looked like angels. His voice trailed off. Ah, lad, the women there. Sims suddenly remembered himself and turned to examine Hawksworth with his glassy eyes. But I fancy you're a bit young to appreciate that part o' it, lad. Then his gaze returned to the fire, and he rambled on, warming to his own voice. And there was poets readin' Persian, and painters drawin' pictures that took days to do one the size of a book page. And the banquets, feasts you're ne'er like to see this side o' Judgment Day. Sims paused to draw on his pipe for a moment, his hands still shaking, and then he plunged ahead. But it was the drugs that did it, lad, what they called Afian and Bang, made out o' poppy flowers and some kind of hemp. Take enough of them and the world around you starts to get lost. After a while, you ne'er want to come back. It killed the others, lad. God only knows how I escaped. Then Sims took up his well-rehearsed monologue about the wealth he'd witnessed. Stories of potential trade that had earned him a place at many a merchant's table. His tale expanded, becoming ever more fantastic, until it was impossible to tell where fact ended and wishful fabrication began. Although Sims had never actually met any Indian officials, and though the letter from Queen Elizabeth had been lost en route, his astonishing story of India's riches inspired the greed of all England's merchants. Excitement swelled throughout London's Cheapside as traders began to clamor for England to challenge Portugal's monopoly of the sea passage around the Cape. Sims, by his inflated, half-imaginary account, had unwittingly sown the first seeds of the East India Company. Only young Brian Hawksworth, who nourished no mercantile fantasies, seemed to realize that Roger Sims had returned from India quite completely mad.